All right, what's up, everyone? My name's Aaron. I'm an airframe and power plant mechanic with 12 years' experience. I specialize in avionics work. But just because I'm an avionics guy doesn't mean that I can't play around with sheet metal from time to time. In fact, I really enjoy it. I just love the precision it takes to make a clean product. And I think that's what it's all about. At the end of the day, you want to be proud of the work you accomplish. But that's enough rambling for now. Let's talk about what I'm doing. In my hands, I have a piece of 32 thousandths aluminum sheet metal and a combination square. I have predetermined that I need a piece of sheet metal that's approximately 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. I adjusted the combination square accordingly, and I'm taking the Sharpie and marking it at the end. The nice thing about a combination square is that the line that you mark is always 90 degrees perpendicular with respect to the piece that you're working with. In other words, you get a nice straight line. And when you're dealing with sheet metal, straight lines are the foundation of a sound product. I've marked some X's to identify which pieces are scrap. Let's go cut it out. Using this tool here to cut, it further exemplifies the importance of having straight lines. I'm going to be drilling some holes in this sheet metal. So what I'm doing with the combination square is carefully measuring out my minimum edge distance for the size of rivets that I'm going to be using. I knew ahead of time that I need to make a hole in the center of this sheet, so I'm using this machinist scale to measure the corners, mark a line in the center, and where those lines intersect is my center. I'm going to be putting a lot of holes in this because I'm going to be fastening it with rivets. So what I'm doing here, with respect to the edge, is marking out my rivet spacing. I typically like to use a fine point Sharpie for this, but I currently can't find one. So this one will have to do for now. This part of the process is extremely tedious, and I thank you for staying with me for so long. You'll notice that I have a lot of marks on this piece of sheet metal, and that's because I didn't like the layout of the rivet spacing. Some of them were too close together, and some of them were too close to the edge. In if at some point you're dissatisfied with your layout, it's perfectly fine to just start over, and I did that here. I'm taking my center punch and I'm punching a mark where the lines intersect. Later on, I'll be using that mark as a guide for my drill bit. Without using a center punch and then drilling a hole, your drill bit is more likely to walk all over the piece of sheet metal that you're drilling into. It would be much easier to drill these holes on top of my toolbox, but I don't feel like drilling a hole into the stainless steel top that I have. So I'm using a wood block underneath in conjunction with some clamps, and I'm actually using that combination square underneath to keep it all level. Sometimes you just have to use what's readily available to get the job done, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, I got all the holes drilled and I'm pretty satisfied with it. I need to clamp this down again and bore out the center hole so that it can accept my pilot bit for my hole saw. I'm not going to drill all the way through with the hole saw right here. I'm just making the hole bigger so that when I put the piece in place, I can use that as a guide, and you'll see that here. I'm using a 90-degree pneumatic drill with a number 30 drill bit, and what I'm doing here is transferring my holes. Once I get the first hole drilled, I can take what is called a cleco clamp, which is a device used to go through an existing hole to hold your work in place while you drill consecutive holes. The use of cleco clamps ensures that all of your holes are exactly where you want them. The reason that I'm installing this piece in the first place is because I'm going to drill a hole through the center of that square sheet metal. That's also composite structure that I'm drilling into behind the sheet metal, and when I drill a large hole into it, it compromises the integrity of the structure. So I'm adding this piece of sheet metal here to serve as a doubler. This doubler will ensure that the composite structure behind it won't buckle or rip or tear or just degrade in any capacity. It'll make sure that it maintains its strength. Typically, you want to use more cleco clamps. Ideally, the best method to drill these holes would be to place a clamp and drill the hole next to the cleco clamp, and then add a cleco where you just drilled that hole, and continue this process until all of your holes are drilled. That'll ensure that your template transfers properly. And if I had the supplies to follow that process, I likely wouldn't have missed that hole at the very bottom. Fortunately, it was an easy fix. Space is limited, so I couldn't get my drill in there. So what I'm doing is using a 90-degree offset with the hole saw attached to it, and that'll aid in drilling the hole in such a tight place. This method helps to ensure that my hole is perpendicular to the plane of the structure. Sheet metal and composite is messy work. Don't forget to deburr after you drill. I'm just taking some sandpaper to smooth out some of those rough edges. I wouldn't want to get cut by any of this stuff. And now it's time for the big reveal. This is everyone's favorite part when working with sheet metal. Taking off the plastic, smoothing it down, deburring all the edges and the holes, and getting it ready to attach to the aircraft. I'm using a dogleg deburring tool here with a countersunk bit attached to it. I'm taking special care not to take off too much material. All I want to do is remove the burrs from when I drilled. Now I'm using a file to just round over the edges a little bit. Normally I'd use a die grinder for this, but with such a small piece, I felt the noise was more of a nuisance. Originally I was using just a piece of Scotch-Brite to round over and deburr some of these edges, but I felt that was insufficient, so I grabbed some 320 grit sandpaper to aid with removing some of the high spots. After all of that sanding is completed, we need to take some isopropyl alcohol and wipe this piece down. We need it to be clean for this next step. Contrary to popular belief, aluminum does oxidize, so I'm using this iodine to chemically alter the surface of the metal so that it prevents oxidation. And I suppose I should have chose a better color than gray for added dramatic effect. And now that the piece is treated, primed, and painted, it's time to install it in the aircraft. Once again, I'm using those Cleco clamps to ensure that all of my holes line up. These rivets that I'm using are called Cherry Max rivets, or cherries for short. They are mechanical fasteners. They're also referred to as blind fasteners or blind rivets because they're typically used in places that you can't see behind the work, just like here. This tool that I'm using is called a cherry gun or a cherry puller. It's pneumatically operated and it's super handy when pulling these rivets. Even though that I'm using Cleco clamps, I'm finding that some of my holes aren't exactly lined up, allowing the cherry to go through the hole freely. So what I'm having to do is ream the hole with a drill bit ever so slightly just to allow the rivet to go through. As your work nears completion and those rivets are fastened in place, you can start to remove the Cleco clamps. Some of these holes are being extremely stubborn. I think it's partly because the composite structure behind the plate is actually flexing somewhat as I'm trying to push the rivet through. I think it's worth mentioning that I'm also adding washers to the backside of these blind rivets. I really don't want that composite structure to tear in the future. The washers will help aid in the mechanical strength of the fastener, and it will also provide a solid landing point for the rivet to squeeze over. I'm not sure if you know this or not, but aircraft, or specifically helicopters, vibrate rigorously while flying. I've added this rubber grommet here to prevent these wires from chafing against the metal while the aircraft vibrates in flight. And one by one, I'll feed each connector through that rubber grommet, and I will eventually pull the cable to the desired length that I need. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please stay tuned for more content. We'll see you next time.